So this brings us to the forms of portraiture from the daguerreotype to the carte de visite, which is a newer method of making positive negative images that comes around just a little bit later in the 1850s. First, about daguerreotypes. Now we remember that the daguerreotype was invented in France. It became popular in Europe and the United States, not so much in England in the early years because of copyright and patent restrictions, but in Europe and the United States, it really caught on as a method of portraiture. It was expensive, but it was less expensive than commissioning a portrait painter. It required long exposures, like sitting for a painting. So in the early years of daguerreotype portraiture, the people in the daguerreotypes are posed in ways that are like they would have posed for a painting. So the daguerreotypes from these years as we have them today, many of them we don't know who the photographers were because they were kept by the people who sat for the portraits. They kept the daguerreotypes, but they didn't keep any records of the photographer. But there are a few studios out there that we do know a lot about the daguerreotype work. One of them is Southworth and Hawes, and this is a studio that was based in Boston. It's covered in our book. We don't know much about their sitters. So this is a photograph of two young ladies from around 1850. In the daguerreotypes, because the detail is so precise, we can see a lot of detail in their clothing, in their hair, in their facial expressions. We know that they had to sit very, very still. There were no electric lights, so they are standing indoors underneath an enormous skylight, and it's only the sun coming in through the skylight that gives them enough light to be able to record an image. These are some later daguerreotypes by Southworth and Hawes of women who are likewise unidentified. Albert Sands Southworth, one of the proprietors of Southworth and Hawes, made this photograph in 1848, one of the early examples of self-portraiture, posing in the classical manner. Daguerreotypes were popular for taking photographs of children, and but bear in mind that because the children had to sit so still for the periods of time that it took to expose a daguerreotype, they often would move during that exposure. So you have daguerreotypes of children that look kind of like these do here, where the faces of the children are very blurry. In some daguerreotypes, you can see a posing stand. You can see the edges of one behind the girl on the right. The posing stands are there to help people sit very, very still, but they were very uncomfortable to have the posing stand like touching the back of your head. Some people, in some studios, the posing stands were necessary and helpful, especially if it was a cloudy day and it was going to be an especially long exposure to get that picture taken. But this brings us to the existence of postmortem portraiture. Now we know that in the 1840s and the 19th century in general, um, childhood mortality was much, much higher than it is in our days of vaccinations that have conquered so many of those childhood diseases that were so widespread over 100 years ago. So in most families in the 19th century had the experience of losing one, at least one, and likely many more children at some point in the family's lifetime, because having a daguerreotype made was relatively expensive and time consuming. Often parents had not had a photograph made of their child yet at a time that their child grows sick and dies very quickly. So the practice of having daguerreotypes made of children who have already died, it was commonplace in the early years of photography. It was not seen as the slightest bit morbid. It was the only chance that they would have this image of their children or themselves with their children. And so they wanted to take that opportunity if they could. Because photography came to be associated with death, it came to be a way that people thought of as a way to perpetuate somebody's memory, to keep their image. That was part of the sort of realm of ideas that people associated with photography in these years. So photography is associated with death and mourning in the early years to a degree that we can't really relate to so much anymore now that cameras are so commonplace with us these days. We can take pictures anytime we want to. It wasn't always true. So in this photograph, for example, we have a couple, and it's not clear whether they are a married couple or a father and daughter. We don't know much about these people, but one thing that we can see is that they are posing with a photograph of other family members, and it's consistent with a practice that was widespread at the time for people to pose with photographs of people who they could not be with, either because those people had passed on or because they lived in a different place. Here's a close-up. Those daguerreotypes rendered very, very precise detail, and you get the very subtle qualities of the facial expression with a large plate daguerreotype like this one. Now, there were new technologies that became possible in the 1850s that brought the photograph much closer to the sense of photography that we all know in the 21st century now. The ability to make pictures, make prints from pictures at large scale and inexpensively. And the big game changer is glass plate collodion negatives. So people could make, with this technology, they could make glass plate negatives that did not take very long to expose, that could make as many paper prints as you wanted to, and those paper prints had sharp detail and didn't cost very much. So they're glass plate negatives, they're printed on albumin paper. The drawback of this process is that collodion plates were heavy and they had to be processed wet, and that meant they had to be dark. They had to be protected from light until they had been printed from. So it's a very cumbersome process, but that requires less technical expertise than other photographic techniques that already existed. So collodion negatives and albumin prints were how photography became a mass medium starting in the 1850s. It became less of a rarefied, technical, expensive thing and more of a part of mainstream culture. Quick look at what we would be dealing with for the technology of collodion prints. So the negatives are on glass plates. They have to be stored in a light safe box, and then underneath a black cloth, that negative will be transferred from the box to the camera. The photographer exposes the image on that negative, and then that negative has to be protected from the light, and then it is processed, and then prints can be made from it. Incidentally, the production of albumin paper, the kind of paper that they would make prints from if they're using this kind of negative, albumin paper in its early years was typically produced by factories that hired a lot of women. So here's a photograph of women in the process of making albumin paper. So when those prints, those albumin prints from negatives, come to be printed in large scale, that changes how people use portrait photography. Here is an outside shot of a high-end portrait studio, the studio of Nadar. He went by one name in Paris. He made portraits of famous people, and those portraits were distributed widely among the public, and they were widely collected. So these were albumin prints of a famous stage actress named Sarah Bernhardt. This leads to the growth of what are called cartes de visite, or cabinet cards. So albumin prints make it possible to print photographs cheaply and in multiples. This leads to a certain kind of practice where people want to have these photographs printed in large quantities, and the carte de visite allows for multiple poses per sitting. So you can have stacks and stacks of prints, kind of like the way people used to do for senior photos, where they would have a whole stack of photos and they'd hand them out to all their friends. That's what they did with cartes de visite or cabinet cards. They could pass out pictures of themselves to friends and acquaintances that were popular for collecting and trading among the upper classes. Cards of famous figures and novelties were affordable and widespread. So here are some cartes de visite or cabinet cards of a lovely lady from the 1860s. When they were originally taken, the print would be a print of 8 images altogether, and then it would be cut down into separate images, and those images would be mounted. The camera for a carte de visite would be something like this. So there are 4 different lenses, but they would be exposed independently, but they would be exposed onto the same plate. So one picture at a time would be taken onto one plate, and then that plate would have ultimately all 8 negatives because they'd move that negative in the process of shooting it. So you'd end up with a finished set of images that might look something like this. You can see that each one of these sittings is slightly different from the others, some of them more different than others. So these cartes de visite allowed their relatively wealthy subjects who were posing for them in these years to be able to present themselves to the public in the way that they wish to be presented. So here they're using photography to craft a public image. In this case, you can see that the subject decided to have one photograph that is probably intended more for private use. And these cartes de visite, these cabinet cards, would be widely disseminated. Sometimes they'd publish them by the thousands, and people would collect them so that they could have cabinet cards of famous people, and they'd fill albums with them. And those photographs would occupy the space in the same albums as travel pictures from places that they may have been or may not even have been themselves. Now, this photo album gives you an idea of what it would have been like for people who could afford to have portraits made of themselves and family members and collect photographs from the people who they knew. And then they could take those pictures and put them into an album for their family's legacy. So you can see that there are photographs of a number of different formats in here, larger ones and smaller ones. And this was possible by the 1860s and 1870s. All this particular album comes from a little bit later. So once they have these photographs that are printed onto paper, they can cut them apart and collage them back together and assemble them in ways that are really up to the user, and then those albums belong to them. They could also collect the photographs of people who they never might have known, who were never famous. So these photographs are both for the wealthy to take pictures of themselves and disseminate pictures of themselves, but also for everyday common people. For not very much money at all, you can collect photographs of the people whose images you want to be surrounded by, like this carte de visite of Abraham Lincoln from 1863. And these cabinet cards were also made not just of famous people, but of these sort of what you could call novelty subjects. And they eventually started being used as promotional items in themselves. The way that we have baseball cards, for example, these days, people collect baseball cards that were originally packaged with a piece of gum inside of the package. That's descended from this early practice of putting these collectible cabinet cards into packages of cigarettes. cigarettes to promote the cigarettes. So when people would buy the pack of cigarettes, they get this, cute little picture that they can keep along with the package of cigarettes. So this is using photography for marketing purposes and for entertainment purposes. And these are multiple purposes of the carte de visite or the camera card.